Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 162, April 22nd to April 28th, 1864. Last week, we wrapped up action in the Camden Expedition portion of the Red River Campaign. Frederick Steele was unable to communicate and support Banks from where he was in Arkansas. Likewise, supply problems would force him to withdraw. We also had a Confederate attack on the forts outside of Plymouth, North Carolina, the rebels gaining a victory there and perhaps repeating some atrocities that had occurred at Fort Pillow. We will actually head back to North Carolina to conclude some naval action there. Before we do that, though, we need to head to Alabama and actually set up the Battle of the Wilderness as well. First, though, let's go ahead and wrap up things in Louisiana. Of course, before we get into that, though, we need to talk about Patreon content. And, of course, we have picture slideshow for this month. We did the Wilderness Battlefield, and the modern-day battlefield, that is, a picture slideshow of some of the events that we're actually going to be talking to here next week, actually. We will be getting into the Wilderness. That'll be episode 163. So that is a very good companion piece to that episode. You can see sort of the modern battlefield and what it looks like. And like I said, some of the places we will be talking about. And then as we get into May here, we're going to go back to a movie review. We're going to do The Field of Lost Shoes, which is going to be about the Battle of Newmarket. And most notably, the involvement with the VMI cadets in that action. So we will go back to the movies, right? So if any of the other movies we've done before, we did a back-to-back Beguiled episode. We did Red Badge of Courage. We've done, of course, the classics, Gettysburg Glory. We've done memoir reviews, Company H, very famous memoir from Sam R. Watkins, who serves in a Tennessee regiment in the sub-theater of the war. Otherwise, some people call that the West. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. And of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. We will conclude the Red River Campaign this week, picking up on action we left off from a couple of weeks ago. When last in the area, Richard Taylor had won a big victory at Mansfield, otherwise known as Sabine Crossroads. Even though he was not supposed to bring on a general engagement, he immediately tried to follow it up with Pleasant Hill or Pleasant Grove, which was not the best idea since the attack failed to materialize the way he wanted to, and thus the Union Army was able to fend off his assault, in the process inflicting casualties that, and we're going to sound like a broken record, that the Confederates can ill afford to lose. Kirby Smith would then sap his command of its strength, leaving Taylor with a subpar amount of men to really hit at Banks, although he is still going to try. Smith and Taylor would bump heads as a result of this disagreement, eventually resulting in Taylor being removed from the department. But in April of 1864, there would be a potential opportunity for the Confederates to trap the Union Army around the Cane River. What Taylor still had, much in the same way that Price did during the first part of the Camden Expedition, was a decided advantage in cavalry. Under the overall direction of Tom Green, there were divisions under Hamilton B., Patrick Major, and William Steele. B would be making a move toward the Union Army, while Green would attempt to make a move at the Navy. Porter is still going to have his river fleet, which we have neglected during the land parts of the operation. Remember that they would have tough going with some of the preparations the Confederates made on the way towards Shreveport. Notably, there was actually an effort to lower the water level, meaning that the ships couldn't really get up the river to a position where they could bombard the city. So, pretty interesting engineering undertaking there. Porter would have his command, as well as infantry under the command of Thomas Kilby Smith, to deal with anything the rebels could throw at him. With Banks having his advance grounding to a halt, and the water levels dropping as mentioned, Porter would go ahead and turn around. St. John Little, who you remember from the sub-theater, would pepper the Navy as they pushed back toward Grant Encore. At a spot called Blair's Landing, Greene was dispatched to try to spring an ambush and maybe bag some monitors. He would have 750 men and 2 batteries reportedly to deal with the enemy. On April 12th, the rebels would engage with Porter, with small arms being peppered into the ironclads. Several of the vessels would respond with grape shot, but there would be few men in terms of casualties. Both sides would suffer around 60, and there would be some minor damages to the ships. The biggest result of the skirmishing, however, would be that a round would nearly decapitate Tom Green as the action was drawn to a close. Green has been with us for some time and has proven to be especially effective in Louisiana, an aggressive and capable cavalry commander. His loss in a relatively minor engagement for the Confederates would be major for the Confederacy as a whole. Taylor, of course, would now turn his attention toward Banks, who was stalled at the Cane River as mentioned. B and his cavalry contingent had blocked the road across the river back toward friendly Alexandria. Taylor had given B, the brother of Bernard B, who you remember as being a casualty of the Battle of First Manassas, the order to hold his position at all hazards. It was B who was going to take over for Green. The other parts of Taylor's command would set up to block other avenues of exit, but this was probably the more important route. It would be critical to block the Federal Army into their current predicament, and, with just a cavalry command, Taylor was going to have a tough time of it, lacking a large amount of infantry. A.J. Smith had been plucky in his rearguard action, so Banks still had some fight in him. Franklin would relinquish command to William Emery, who would be a good choice as a replacement. An escaped, enslaved individual named Tom would alert him that despite the strong position the rebels seemingly held, there was a ford of the river that could be used to flank them. Emery would devise a plan where he would use part of Cuvier Grover's command, arrive from Alexandria, and the brigade formerly commanded by Louis Benedict in a demonstration and an assault. The brigade, commanded by William Fessenden, would attack B's command under the direction of Henry Burge. On April 23rd, the assault would be launched, the Union troops hitting Baylor's Arizona command. Pressured from the front, B would not offer as much in terms of his support for Baylor, who was hard-pressed. His Arizona Rangers and Texas partisans would be heavily involved in the fight. Attacked from the front, Union cavalry would also cross the river, posing maybe a threat to B's opposite flank. He would withdraw, even with casualties lopsided on the side of the Union, suffering 300 compared to maybe 50 on the side of the rebels. Taylor would become irate at the fact that B did not put up a better defense, in fact going so far as removing him from his command. B had a point that water levels at the Cane were low, and there wasn't a lot in terms of support. In fact, Taylor was outnumbered by several thousand men. B could have done better to fend off the actual flank assault without the feints, but as it was, Banks was going to be free to move toward Alexandria and safety. Alexandria and the surrounding parishes would feel the strain of having a dejected Union army now tramp through their home. Farms and cotton were burned, and the town of Alexandria being fired by Union troops. One Iowa soldier would write, "Of course there was no apology for the incendiary, nor is there much sympathy in the army for the citizens. They have brought by their rebellion an army into their midst, and they must expect not only to submit to the proper and authorized results of military occupation, but also suffer from unmilitary, unauthorized, and wanton acts of those bad men who are to be found in every army. As to making war upon women and children, the only question in my mind as to whether it is most proper to shoot the rebel father and husband or to burn down the shelter of his family is one of policy. If by the latter course he could be induced for a brief season to forego the exercise of his amiable intention to kill me and devote his little furlough into the reinstatement of his household goods, I'm almost certain that I should incline to the incendiary policy." So, wow, that's pretty harsh there, right? A couple of takeaways that we can have from this action. First and foremost, in this statement, right, we have an individual on the opposite side of the equation from some of these other episodes that we've been talking about. We've been talking about the frustration level of some of the Confederate soldiers and how there is this occupying force. We're having a little flip of that, and we can see some of the frustration of a Union soldier. And as we talk about the wilderness setting that up later this episode and into next episode, there is this kind of change in the armies. But at this point in the war, there are conscripts, yes, but at this point in the war, if you're still in the ranks, you're pretty comfortable with committing these acts and killing your fellow man because you're just honed in by these years of war and conflict. And you can kind of see that coming out in this quote here. Now, the other thing I do want to talk about is that a lot is put into Banks and his failures. And we kind of mentioned how Kirby Smith, I think it's sort of implied that he makes the wrong decision in shifting some of these infantry units away from this portion of the campaign. And it's understandable why he does so. He needs to sort of meet the threat that Frederick Steele has. And then there's this opportunity where Frederick Steele is retreating with his army. So maybe he's able to inflict some casualties, maybe trap that army, that force. He does have a very strong mounted wing, and then this added weight of the infantry in that sector. However, here, a lot of these soldiers are going to be used in the Eastern Theater and in theaters abroad. So the ability to make sure that these reinforcements, these combat veterans, some of them are not getting to these other places is super important. And I've seen it argued in a couple different sources that that's really the value of this campaign for the Confederates, is that if they are really able to destroy Banks, then that does have an impact on campaigns abroad. A.J. Smith's men were well used to laying waste to the country, having participated in the Meridian Campaign. It would be these individuals who carry out a lot of the arson. There was a problem with Porter's gunboats, who were stopped by low water. A dam was built in order to allow the ship safe passage down the river, which took some time to build. Taylor would still attempt to get at Banks, even though his real opportunities were at this point most likely lost. May 16th would see the Confederates place themselves in front of the Federal columns at a place called Mansura. An open prairie separated the two forces, Taylor and the Federals settling for an artillery duel. When it became apparent the Union infantry was drawing up for an attack, Taylor would withdraw his 5,000 or so cavalrymen. The rebels would continue to try to harass the Union lines, the 92nd United States Colored Troops making a bold stand protecting a wagon train before Confederate cavalry. Taylor would try to get at them one last time at a place called Yellow Bayou on May 18th. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bailey, who had designed the dam earlier in the month, would design a way to lash together boats so that the Union Army could get to safety. Taylor was very close to the Federals, meaning that Banks decided to check the aggressive commander. Joseph Maurer would gather 3 brigades to accomplish this task. His forces would run into Confederate skirmishers, and soon the main body of rebels. Although mostly dismounted cavalry, the Southerners would aggressively charge the Union positions. Maurer's infantry would write about the fierce nature of the fighting. Many of them remembered that the batteries accompanying would fire double canister. Despite the ineffectual attacks, William Parsons would be threatened via court-martial by Gabriel Wharton to attack. Wharton would eventually be killed by Baylor over a disagreement at whose fault it was at the Cane River crossing. The rebels would be repulsed, Maurer eventually being able to withdraw back to the main Union Army. 600 Confederates were casualties compared to around 350 on the side of the Union. So, with the Battle of Yellow Bayou and the Union Army getting to safety, we have the end of the Red River Campaign. But the question is exactly what to make of this action. We have mentioned before of campaigns or battles really not accomplishing much, and the Red River Campaign would be high on that list. It diverted resources and failed to accomplish its objective. If you think about it, the Confederates are already going to be in this situation regardless. Like, Kirby Smith is not going to be able to support the other regions of the Confederacy, but certainly Banks could have supported Sherman and Grant in a different way, maybe attacking Mobile, as Grant really wanted to. So it's really just kind of diverting resources away from that. Poor planning had led to 2 Union columns being unable to ably support one another. Kirby Smith could have had real opportunity to destroy Banks, which would have taken these men away from the war effort elsewhere, as mentioned. Their survival back to friendly lines may well have been the biggest thing to come out of the campaigning for the Union. This was all time and effort that could have been used to try to take a more strategically important Mobile, Alabama, or also, as mentioned, could have been used as reinforcements in other parts of the war. We must say goodbye to Nathaniel Banks, as he will be sent back to Massachusetts and Congress. Winchester, now the Red River, there would not be a third major gaffe by the political general. We will also get to the conclusion of action around Plymouth, North Carolina, which we talked about last week. We went over the joint Navy and infantry operations that the Confederates had undertaken. They would wish to press the advantage on the water. Robert Hoke would wish to try to retake New Bern as well, the CSS Albemarle being considered an important part of that plan, just as it had been at Plymouth. Thus, the Union Navy would realize this and dispatch a squadron of 8 warships under the direction of Melcanton Smith to watch the approach into the Sound. On May 5th, the Albemarle under James Cook and 2 additional vessels, the Cotton Plant and Bombshell, would emerge to face the USS Commodore, Hull, Ceres, Miami, Wylissing, Secaucus, Mattabesset, Whitehead, and Isaac Seymour. Several of these vessels were armed with 100-pound Parrott guns, a strong showing against the rebel Brooke rifles. The Albemarle was only armed with 2, as we might have mentioned, with other rebel ironclads. Cook would open things up by trying to ram the Marabesset, which was Smith's flagship during the engagement, but the side-wheeling vessel was able to avoid the enemy ram. Marabesset, Secaucus, and Wylissing would unleash heavy volleys into the Albemarle, but they would not be as effective. The Cotton Plant would be forced to withdraw, and the Bombshell, which had been captured at Plymouth, would be recaptured by the Federal Navy. Cook would be on his own against the enemy, who now turned their full attention to him. The Secaucus was armed with a large brass ram, which they attempted to use, hitting their target. The Confederates would unleash their Brooke rifles into the vessel at close range before breaking off, the Union vessel limping away. The USS Miami would also try to ram the rebels, but they too would hit at close range and veer off. For several hours, the Federals had engaged the CSS Albemarle, but darkness would bring the engagement to a close. At the cost of 31 Union casualties to 57 on the side of the rebels, the contest had been a draw. The CSS Albemarle was prevented from participating in Hoke's attempt at New Bern, and soon would be torpedoed. Hoke, for his part, would soon be called into Richmond, as events were overtaking the region in Virginia. One thing that we should briefly mention moving forward is that there will be no prisoner exchanges. A while ago, we talked about the Dix Hill Cartel and the agreement both sides made for exchanges. Well, with the introduction of black troops to the battlefield, it would now become apparent that there needed to be a change in policy, especially if they were not going to be given the same treatment. Grant would see Fort Pillow, notably, and to a less degree, Poison Springs and Plymouth as problems. He would wish Benjamin Butler, who was negotiating to reopen the exchanges to include the black soldiers and their white officers. This would be refused by Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon. Thus, if you recall from all the way back in 1861, we talked about prisoner of war camps and how they would expand during this year, straining the infrastructure, especially in the South. Many point to Grant and his past experiences, notably Vicksburg, as his reasoning for not allowing these exchanges, and that certainly could have been part of it, but we also have the fair treatment of all soldiers as a major factor. You see in a lot of sources where Grant is mentioned as being this guy who he wants to be very harsh toward the Confederacy, and to a degree, he really does. However, there is this abandoning of the cartel is definitely pointed as Grant the Butcher more than Grant having any kind of morals. And we know he does have these moral values. We might have mentioned in a previous episode when we were introducing Grant how in a position of poverty, he actually has one enslaved individual who he emancipates, and instead of maybe perhaps gaining some kind of monetary return in a position that would really help his family out, he decides he's going to really stand on his morals and not go through with that plan. So we know that he does have this kind of depth that goes beyond just him as a butcher, and I always like to remember that these are real people, right? You know, from the enlisted men all the way up to these generals, and that's a big piece of why he decides to not continue with these prisoner exchanges. Speaking of Grant, I think it's time we had a setup not only for the Wilderness, but also the Overland Campaign in general. We are about to kick off probably the busiest few weeks we could possibly have during the entire war, because there will be essentially constant combat. Now, let's just go over the plans first, and then the army makeups. As we have now mentioned, Grant has come to take the reins of the Northern War effort. In fact, so that there is no confusion, he will receive the rank of Lieutenant General, something that has not been done since George Washington. Not even our guy Winfield Scott was able to get Lieutenant Generalship, which tells you a lot because he was really the premier general after Washington up until the Civil War. The planned offenses will be widespread, as we talked about. Sherman is preparing to move on Atlanta, with Grant hoping there could be a strike at Mobile, which is another fallout from the Red River Campaign, just sort of wasting time and resources. In Virginia, Benjamin Butler would land at Bermuda Hundred, marching on Richmond and hopefully linking up with Grant, who will attach himself to the Army of the Potomac. Remember, Butler had had a similar idea in the winter that resulted really in a failed effort at Morton's Ford. Franz Sigel would move down the valley, which would then mean the Confederates would have to scramble to defend against everything. Lee will be desperately calling for the return of Pickett and reinforcements to be sent from North Carolina, where PGT Beauregard is, but Davis, for the time being, will stall on that. As it was, there were brigades being withheld for the purposes of facing Butler, and an army is going to be cobbled together in the valley, which will of course include the Vietnamite cadets, but that is a story for another time. Overall, the winter had not been kind to Lee, who still had his forces scattered and his men not well supplied along the Rapidan line. The poor infrastructure was making it so that much-needed forage and supplies was not reaching the army. 2 cavalry brigades were operating in the valley, reducing his once-strong mounted wing. And yet, even with all these factors against him, he was still itching at an opportunity to strike at Meade. But Meade was also getting ready. Chief of Staff Andrew Humphreys was designing a plan of march. You see, there were 2 options for the Federals: flank Lee on the left or flank Lee on the right. Attacking Lee in the center has not gone well. Ask Ambrose Burnside. And it will be easy to ask him, as we will get here in a minute. If they were to flank him on the left, the rebels would have ample opportunity to meet the threat. This would also make it so that the O&A Railroad would be the primary source of supply for the army, which really had not worked well during the Bristow Station and Mine Run campaigning in 1863. If they were to flank to the right, then they would pass through an area of dense woodland known as the Wilderness, very close to the old Chancellorsville battlefield. But if they could move quickly, they might be able to wedge themselves in between Lee and Richmond. Additionally, Lee would then have to react in a variety of ways. Less likely was a move on Washington itself. More likely was a fallback to his old Mine Run defenses. As the movement would unfold, Ambrose Burnside and his 9th Corps would check any movement on Washington, while the remainder of the army was free to pursue Lee. The only issue with the plan was the Wilderness itself. The Union Army held the numerical advantage, and dense undergrowth would negate advantages in artillery or numbers. Getting out of that area with speed would be the name of the game. Let's talk about the makeup of the Federal forces in Virginia. There has been much reorganizing on the part of Meade, which sometimes is attributed to Grant, but instead of 7th Corps, there will be 3 larger corps, which aligns more with the Confederates. A bigger span of control creating battlefield effectiveness. So there will be a 2nd Corps under Hancock, returned from his Gettysburg wound, the 5th under Gouverneur Warren, and the 6th under Uncle John Sedgwick. Remember, we may have mentioned how veterans from, say, the 3rd Corps or the 1st Corps were a little upset that their units had been disbanded. But I think as we cover these, you're going to hear a lot of familiar names. Hancock would have 4 divisions under Francis Barlow, John Gibbon, David Birney, and Gershom Mott. Mott has been around in our story for a while, being a lieutenant colonel of a New Jersey regiment during the Peninsular Campaign and 7 Days. He will continue to serve in the Eastern Theater, returning to his home state of New Jersey after the war. Barlow, who has also recovered from his Gettysburg wound, would have brigades under Nelson Miles, the Irish Brigade under Thomas Smith, German immigrant Paul Frank commanding a primarily New York brigade, and John R. Brooke commanding a mixed outfit. The very soldierly Gibbon would have brigades under Alexander Webb, commanding amongst others the 15th Massachusetts, Joshua Owen commanding the Philadelphia Brigade, and Samuel Sprigg Carroll with his brigade, which included the 8th Ohio, who you remember from Pickett's charge, being out on the flank. Carroll's brigade would also be known as the Gibraltar Brigade. Owen is an interesting figure, having been originally born in Wales, immigrating to Philadelphia. He's been serving in the Philadelphia Brigade as far back as Ball's Bluff. Remember when they were called California regiments. Alexander Webb actually took over for him because of a court-martial, and it would not be the last time he was in such trouble. Owen actually being court-martialed for disobeying orders at Cold Harbor and then being discharged. Birney has Hobart Ward and Alexander Hayes, Hayes being electric at Cemetery Ridge if you recall. Mott would have Colonel Robert McAllister and William Brewster commanding the Excelsiors. Warren has divisions under Charles Griffin, John C. Robinson, Samuel Crawford, and James Wadsworth. Griffin has Roman heirs in his mixed brigade, including regulars, Jacob Schweitzer, who if you remember from the Wheatfield, and Joseph Bartlett. Bartlett was a lawyer before the war who has participated in South Mountain and been mostly held reserve at Gettysburg. Robinson has Colonel Samuel Leonard, Henry Baxter, and Andrew Dennison commanding a Maryland brigade. Samuel Crawford would have his Pennsylvania reserves under McCandless and Joseph Fisher. Buck McCandless was a lawyer and a machinist before the war. He has served in Pennsylvania, and actually the Pennsylvania Reserves, for some time, and will be mustered out later in the year. Fisher also has been in the Pennsylvania Reserves, originally a lawyer from that state. He was called out by Joshua Chamberlain unjustly for supposedly not advancing to take Big Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg. He will be mustered out and serve as Chief Justice of the Wyoming Territory after the war. Wadsworth has some of his old 1st Corps boys, including the Iron Brigade under Lysander Cutler, James Rice commanding mostly New Yorkers, and Roy Stone's bogus Bucktails. Sedgwick's 6th Corps has divisions under Horatio Wright, George Getty, and James Ricketts, if you remember Ricketts from all the way back at 2nd Manassas. Wright we may have mentioned before as a West Pointer and engineer. He actually has been serving in various capacities, including as a key logistical organizer for defense of Bragg's invasion into Kentucky. You remember he was slightly involved in the incident where Jefferson Davis murders Bull Nelson. He was actually the superior. Davis was actually sent to report to him, and then Wright sends him back. Starts the argument there in Louisville. Wright is going to serve throughout the war, and then afterwards participate in several engineering projects, including the Brooklyn Bridge and the Washington Monument. Getty was also a West Pointer, and has served as an artillery officer for much of the war. He has most recently been in our story serving under Dix and against Longstreet during the failed Suffolk campaign. Wright has a New Jersey brigade under Henry Brown, Emory Upton, David Russell, and Alexander Shaler. Upton has been mentioned in our story before, serving in the 121st New York. We will certainly highlight his achievement at Spotsylvania soon. Upton will continue to serve and actually rise through the ranks, becoming a general at only 25 years old. He will then create some reforms within the army after the end of hostilities. Russell was a New York native and career soldier who will fall in the Valley Campaign of 1864. Shaler was born in Connecticut and has served in the Sixth Corps. He will spend some time in Libby Prison, becoming the commissioner of the New York Fire Department after the conflict. Getty has Frank Wheaton, Lewis Grant commanding the Vermont Brigade, Thomas Neal, and Henry Eustis. Wheaton attended Brown before the war, serving as colonel of the 2nd Rhode Island, which you remember as being Elisha Hunt Rhodes's regiment. He will continue to serve in the Army after the war, fighting against Native Americans in the West. Neal was a Philadelphia native and had attended West Point before the war. He has served already in the conflict, notably under Sedgwick at 2nd Fredericksburg. He will continue in the Army after the war. Eustis was an engineer from West Point and Harvard man before the conflict. He reportedly had some opium addiction and will be forced to resign. Ricketts has William Morris and Truman Seymour, fresh off his campaign in Florida. Artillery is under the command of Henry Hunt. Still, but cavalry would have a new chief, that being Phil Sheridan, who wants his mounted men to be used more like combat troops than anything else. Divisions under Alfred Torbett, James McMurtry Gregg, and James Wilson will heavily participate in the campaigning coming up. Alfred Thomas Archimedes Torbert was a Delaware native and had attended West Point. He had been wounded at Crampton's Gap during the Antietam campaign and will take over the 1st Cavalry Division following John Buford's untimely death. After the war, he will go on to serve in some diplomatic roles. James Wilson was a topographical engineer and had recently served as such under Grant, making his appointment a tad puzzling. He's going to continue to serve as a cavalry officer and see action after the conclusion of the Civil War. Torbert has Custer, Thomas Devon, and Wesley Merritt. Gregg has Henry Davies and Irving Gregg. Wilson has McIntosh and George Chapman. Creating another problem for Meade and Grant is going to be the addition of the 9th Corps and Ambrose Burnside to the troop strength. Now, it does give the Federals somewhat in the area of around 120,000 men, but Burnside will actually outrank Meade, so he would have to get orders directly from Grant, which, as you can imagine, would pose a problem. Remember how Burnside gets sapped of his wing command at Antietam, sort of ironic now that he is in the same situation again. His division would be under Thomas Stevenson, Robert Potter, Orlando Wilcox, and Edward Ferrero. Ferrero would be commanding a division of United States colored troops. Stevenson had risen through the ranks, serving in various capacities in the 9th Corps, and also been part of Alfred Terry and his actions around Charleston. About to turn 28 in 1864, he will be killed at Spotsylvania. Stevenson would have Sumner Carruth and Daniel Leisure. Carruth was a Massachusetts native who has served since all the way back at First Bull Run. Leisure had been colonel of the 100th Pennsylvania Regiment, otherwise known as the Roundheads. Potter would have Zinnius Bliss and Simon Griffin. Bliss would actually have a career as a soldier, serving some 46 years. He had won the Medal of Honor leading his men in the 9th Corps at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Griffin was a New Hampshire native who has served in the 9th Corps thus far during the war, continuing to do so until the end of the conflict, at which point he will return to New Hampshire. Wilcox would have Hartranft and Christ, whom we have met before. Ferrero would have Siegfried and Henry Thomas. As mentioned, all told, Meade and subsequently Grant would have the capability to bring some 125,000 men to the field. The Confederate Army should return a lot of names we have already spoken about. Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill are all going to be the corps commanders, the latter two still suffering from previous wounds and illness. Longstreet is still going to be the most capable commander, with Ewell and Hill needing to have the supervision of Lee. Longstreet's First Corps would have many familiar faces. McLaws' old division was commanded by Samuel Kershaw, with John Kennedy commanding his brigade. Kennedy has practiced law in South Carolina before the conflict. He served in the South Carolina Brigade throughout the war and will eventually surrender with Johnston in 1865. Kershaw's other brigades are commanded by Wofford and his Georgians, Humphrey with his Mississippi men, and Goodbrine with his Georgians. Charles Field would command his 2nd Division. Field was a Kentucky native who had served in the Dragoons in the Old Army. He had already served under A.P. Hill in 1862 and been severely wounded at 2nd Manassas. Continuing to serve in the Eastern Theater until the surrender, he will then go to serve in the Egyptian Army after the conclusion. Field would have Micah Jenkins and his South Carolinians, Tige Anderson's Georgians, Rock Benning's Georgians, and now John Gregg commanding the Texas Brigade, and William Perry's Alabama men. E. Porter Alexander would command Longstreet's batteries. Ewell would have divisions under Jubal Early, Allegheny Johnson, and Robert Rhodes. Early still has Hayes and his Tigers, John Pegram commanding some Virginians, and Gordon's Georgians. Johnson has James Walker commanding the Stonewall Brigade, Rum Jones, Maryland Stewart, and Leroy Stafford's Louisiana men. Rhodes has familiar faces in Junius Daniel, George Doles, Stephen Ramseur, Cullen Battle, and Robert Johnson. Cullen Battle was a lawyer from Alabama before the war. Having served since the Peninsula, he would rise to brigade command after Gettysburg, replacing Edward O'Neill, who, if you recall, had left 2 regiments behind, that being Rhodes' old command, in his assault on the first day of that battle. He will continue to serve until the end of the war, eventually becoming heavily involved in veteran affairs. Robert Johnson originally enlisted as a private, having been a lawyer from North Carolina, a practice he will resume after the war. Ewell's artillery is commanded by Armistead Long. Hill has divisions under Richard Anderson, Henry Heath, and Cadmus Wilcox, finally having gained his promotion. Anderson has Abner Perrin, Billy Mahone, Nathaniel Harris and his Mississippi men, Rand's Wright, and Edward Perry's Floridians. Harris was a lawyer who has served in the 19th Mississippi since the Peninsula. He will go on to serve in various capacities out west after the end of the conflict. Heath has John Stone commanding a mixed brigade, John Cook and William Kirkland commanding some North Carolinians, and Archer and Walker's combined brigades. John Stone originally enlisted in the 2nd Mississippi and will go on to be captured. After the war, he will become the governor of Mississippi, passing a lot of legislation that will go against African Americans. John Rogers Cook was actually the son of Philip St. George Cook, who, you remember, was Jeb Stuart's father-in-law, so talk about your awkward family dinners. He will serve throughout the war and actually reconnect with his father after the conflict. William Kirkland was actually in the Marines before the war and will continue to serve until his surrender with Johnston in 1865. Wilcox has James Lane and Alfred Scales with their North Carolinians, Samuel McGowan's South Carolinians, and Henry Thomas's Georgians. Jeb Stuart has a much reduced cavalry arm, but he does still have divisions under Wade Hampton, Fitzhugh Lee, and Rooney Lee recovered from his wound and having been exchanged from Brandy Station. In all, Lee is going to have some 66,000 combatants available to be called upon for battle. This will be part of the reason he seeks the additional support from Davis. If he can bring his full gathered strength to close to 80,000, that looks better on paper compared to the large host Grant is able to throw at him. And throw they shall. If you think about it too, like 80,000, that's probably about the same he gets. Those are about the same odds that he gets at Gettysburg. And he's able to very nearly win that battle. So he thinks if he's able to get back up there in that region, if he has more men at the disposal, and also it's going to allow for him to not only wage this defensive war that Davis is probably wanting him to wage, but it's also going to allow him to strategically act in the offensive. And with 66,000, and then those numbers keep going down, he's just going to be less and less able to do that. May 3rd would mark the kickoff for the planned Union offensive. The Germanna and Ely Forge would be utilized to move the army. Warren and his 5th Corps, followed by Sedgwick, would move on the Germanna Ford and the Germanna Ford Road in the direction of Parker's Store, James Wilson and his cavalry leading the way. Hancock and his 2nd Corps would move out from Ely's Ford. They would see hard marching covering some 25 miles and bivouacking at the site of the old Chancellorsville battlefield. So far, Wilson has not encountered any Confederates except cavalry pickets around the fort itself. The march is going swimmingly, with the next day probably bringing them into the open area beyond the wilderness. It was expected that the 5th would see the two armies come into contact, but it was not going to be the way in which Grant expected. You see, Lee was aware of the movement and wanted to get the enemy. He had 2 corps under Ewell and Hill, and Longstreet was going to make his way quickly to the battlefield from near Gordonsville, hiring a local guide. He had been placed there to support any of the areas affected by the Union offensives. Remember those interior lines. Ewell on the Orange Turnpike and Hill on the Orange Plank Road would speed toward the Federals. Cavalry had moved forward, and thus they would not be readily available to pick up this movement. Although outnumbered, the terrain could negate the advantages held by the Federals, and hopefully Longstreet would not be delayed in his arrival. There was indeed a collision set up for the 5th, but it would come as a surprise to both sides. So we will lay it right down there. This week we talked about the end of Banks and the Red River Campaign. We mentioned naval action in North Carolina and the suspending of prisoner exchanges. We also had a brief setup of the wilderness, something that we will cover in our entire episode next week. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon and Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.